On January 14th, federal agents showed up at the home of Hannah Nathanson, a Washington Post journalist. But instead of providing information, they were there to collect it. They arrived with a search warrant. Agents seized phones and electronic devices as part of an investigation that, according to reporting, was aimed at identifying the journalist's sources. For press freedom advocates, the search crossed a line long treated as fundamental in American journalism. The idea that reporters should be able to protect the people who speak to them. The incident didn't happen in isolation. It came amid months of escalating pressure on news organizations that include political attacks, legal threats, ownership changes, and growing concerns about the influence of powerful interest inside major media companies. For many journalists, it's starting to feel like the guardrails that once protected the press are eroding.
To help us make sense of this moment and what it says about the current state of press freedom, we're talking with Tim Richardson. He's the program director for journalism and disinformation at Penn, America, where he focuses on threats to press freedom and the spread of false information. Before that, Tim spent more than a decade at the Washington Post, including time as a breaking news editor during some of the country's most consequential events, from the protests following the killing of George Floyd to the storming of the U.S. Capitol. We're going to talk with him about Washington Post journalist raid, the broader political climate for journalists, and what it means when the institutions meant to protect a free press start to change. Cory wasn't able to take part in this conversation, so I'll be talking to Tim one-on-one. Tim Richardson, welcome to News Over Noise.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me a little bit about, or tell us a little bit about Penn America, its history and what it does.
Sure. So Penn America is a 103-year-old nonpartisan nonprofit, and we're focused at the intersection of literature and human rights to support free expression. And I kind of think of it as there's kind of two halves to the organization, really. One really focuses heavily on authors, literary works. The other focuses heavily, and this is where my area is, on free expression. So specifically, I work on journalism and disinformation. We have teams that work on fighting book bans. We have teams that work toward advocating for higher education and other instances of free expression. But those are really the two the two main buckets of work really within the organization.
What was happening 102 years ago what was the impetus for the starting of Penn America?
That is a great question. I will say Penn America is one of many, many Penns all across the world. So while Penn America is the largest, it is certainly not the only Penn. There are organizations across the world. And so we are really just one of many in that regard.
Well, the timing is correct in a way, insofar as for about a century, I guess that would have been around the time of the founding of Penn America, and then for about a century, America was doing really well with press freedom, right? We were kind of continuing to be this kind of beacon on a hill. Other democracies would look at us, we were compared with, and then things started to slide a little bit. And so over the last bit of time here, the Reporters Without Borders has an index of world press freedom, and the United States for the last decade or so has been sliding. I think in the last count, in the 2005 Press Freedom Index, we went from 55 to 57. And again, there are a variety of reasons for that. But what has been happening to the press in America?
So this has been a long slide, I think, for a lot of reasons, many of them good. We focused a lot on some of the assaults against the First Amendment, assaults against a free press that have happened, just in recent years, maybe over the past 12 months. But this has not been something, those assaults on a free press have not just happened, over the past year or so. It's lots of things have happened. And, part of that is, I think, the discrediting of the news media has been a huge part of that. We've seen that happening for years. Certainly when Trump took office during his first term, there was a significant amount of rhetoric that was targeted at reporters and credible information. We've seen that continue now. But I do think that in some cases, in some ways, that has been effective. I mean, that's, I think, the reality. We see that trust in the news media is now at a historic low. I believe it was pegged at something like 28% a few months ago, and it's never been lower than that. So I think that A lot of it also has to do with the fractured media environment. Everyone is kind of, choosing your own adventure. There's confirmation bias of people seeking out information where they know their ideology and their viewpoints will not be challenged. And in some of those instances, there is a continued discrediting of, you can call it the mainstream media, the legacy media. I like to say, kind of credible reporters, credible outlets, but there is that demonization and a lot of critical content focused on outlets that are providing credible information. And that has just kind of whittled down the trust in the news media over the years. And I think a lot of that is why we are where we are in this moment.
Yeah, a lot of the start of the attack on the press, starts around the late '60s, with the kind of attack on the bias of journalists, right? That became a strategy. Other than other than degrading the trust of the public, what is some of the outcome of divisive rhetoric, like calling reporters enemy of the people and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen right reporters, certainly enemy of the people was something that came out a few years ago, but I think what we saw kind of what we've moved from a lot of the rhetoric that we saw, in the first Trump administration to more recently over these past 12, 13 months, a lot of action. And I think that is really what makes this moment different. And it is not just the White House, it is much of the entire administration that has implemented policies, regulation, from the standpoint of the FCC to really harm a free press. And, I mean, you mentioned some of the insults. We've seen the president called reporters piggy, terrible, making critical comments about their appearance, certainly their intelligence. And it's definitely worth noting that the vast majority of these insults have targeted female reporters as well. And, we do continue to see those insults creep up along with a lot of the other, it's not just rhetoric, but it's action and it's lawsuits. And I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about some of those things that we're seeing. But there certainly has been a very intense escalation in a lot of these actions and rhetoric, but also, actions and lawsuits and those sorts of things that have happened over the last several months.
Given the scope of the many pens around the world, free press associations around the world, how much of this is stuff that others have seen around the world, and what does it usually portend to?
I think that's a great question because a lot of our work in the press freedom space focused overseas for several years ago. We weren't doing a lot of press freedom work in the United States in the way that we are now because there wasn't really the same need for it. The press is, I think, more respected. Certainly, the threats to a free press were a fraction of what they were now. But that has changed. A lot of organizations, Penn America included, have focused significantly their work on defending a free press in the United States because it is under attack in ways that we've never seen in modern history. So, some of those resources that have been used, and not just Penn, but many organizations, press freedom organizations have shifted resources back here, back home, for those that are, based domestically, to try to advocate for a free press here in the U.S. and because it just wasn't something that was necessarily needed in the past.
So let's get into some of the details of that. You said a second ago that what we're seeing in the last 12 months or so, and maybe some of this kind of started in the first Trump administration, is of a different type of coercion. And we had little bits of coercion. We might have had some access, kind of denying people access before. But what has changed that has been surprising to you?
So there really has been an onslaught of actions targeting a free press, but I think you have to take it, there's a bigger picture here, and that is the really, kind of the targeting of credible information that would allow the administration to insert its narrative and try to dominate that narrative. If you can clamp down on the credible information that's coming from outlets and journalists whose entire mission is to hold power to account, and you can insert your own narrative that gives you more power to further your narrative. So Look at the very first weeks in office when the White House banished the Associated Press from the press pool over content, really, because the Associated Press refused to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. That is a case that's still winding its way through court. We've seen the Pentagon boot out the press corps, outlets that have for decades held the Pentagon and its leadership to account for its decisions. They were gone because they had to leave essentially because they refused to sign an agreement with the Pentagon that in essence would not have allowed them to do journalism within the walls of the Pentagon. So the Pentagon is still being held to account by credible reporters, but they're doing it from home or they're doing it in their newsroom as opposed to within the Pentagon itself. We've seen the president personally file lawsuits against media organizations over content that he doesn't like. We've seen the defunding of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which Voice of America is the outlet that's maybe most well known within that, but there are others, Voice of America and others, or Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia. We've seen the defunding of public media, NPR, PBS losing their federal funding. That's a move, of course, that Congress approved, but at the request of the president. So there is a very long line of attacks against the media that we have seen from the beginning of the administration through now. And of course, more recently, we had the FBI raid against Washington Post reporter Hannah Nathanson's house, which was just unprecedented. We've had 2 arrests of journalists, Don Lemon and Georgia Fort. So those are, there really has been a very significant escalation. And one of the things that's surprising to me is how I think there is I think there's a lack of understanding or a lack of awareness, from the public as to what exactly is happening from a press freedom standpoint. There was a study that was done earlier in the administration in Trump 2.0, looking at awareness, public awareness of the threats to a free press, and it is, the percentage of Americans who are aware of what is happening is roughly half what it was during Trump's first term. That was a study that was done several months ago. It is quite possible that awareness has increased. I haven't seen any, updated surveys in that regard, but that is something that I have personally found alarming. Is just that lack of awareness there.
It's very surprising to me that there is a lack of awareness. You would think that an industry that is under attack, that is at least attack either through kind of overt ways or subtle coercive ways, and there are many of those that we could talk about as well, would rally, would circle the wagons, would everybody would be writing about this. Why do you think that the press has been so silent about the attack on the press?
I don't know that I guess I wouldn't necessarily say the press has been silent about it. I just think that there has been a ton of news. There is a constant onslaught of news happening every way you look. There's a new headline. That headline lasts a day or two. A news cycle that used to last for a few days now it lasts for a day or even a few hours, of course, depending on the case. So I think it is just that our attentions we're being forced to look in so many different directions that it's unless this is something that people understand directs them effectively. Of course, I would argue that it does, but I think for the average American, it's kind of hard to see how they think this maybe is something that is affecting journalists as opposed to their personal lives. And meanwhile, you've got 10 other headlines that are happening and these other huge stories, and there's never really an end to it. And I think that is a lot of the reason behind it.
Well, I mean, recently we saw a journalist basically being attacked almost on screen, in terms of because the video was available. We had in Minneapolis, we had 6 journalists who were attacked by ICE agents, John Abernathy, a photographer for Getty, Whitney Wild for CNN, Jalissa Doggerut from Mint Press News, J.T. Sestowski from Status Group, John Farina from Status Group, King Demetrius Pendleton from Listen Media. These are people that were attacked basically on screen, and yet the public still is sleeping on this. It seems odd.
Yeah, we've seen these assaults against reporters happening in several places now. Of course, we saw them, what's happened in Minneapolis in these last few weeks has been awful. And yet it follows what we saw earlier in Chicago, which, follows earlier, what we saw earlier in Los Angeles. We've seen this take place in New York. And so this has happened all across the country. And we've seen journalists assaulted at the hands of ICE agents. And I think what is also we also have to remember that some of the government's narratives that have come out of some of these events, and I'm specifically thinking about the shootings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, how those narratives were frankly not correct. I mean, they were false. They were false narratives from the government. It was disinformation being peddled by the government, and I think that is another. It's forcing journalists to continue to do work reporting on these kind of difficult stories at the same time when there's an entire economic crisis around journalism. There were fewer reporters, and of course, as you mentioned, they're being attacked in American streets, and I think it's kind of a perfect storm at the same time that the work that they're doing is really more crucial than I think frankly that we've seen in quite some time as well.
Yeah, I mean, it is confusing that the press has been so slow to respond with different modes of reporting, right? That, there's a kind of a standard way of reporting government where official source says something, that source is quoted. But we've seen, like, as you said, with the ICE attacks in Minneapolis, in other words, the administration basically embraced misinformation as a strategy,
Absolutely.
putting out these false frames. Do you think that it might behoove people in the press to maybe not so credulously and stenographically report everything that the administration says?
Well, I wouldn't say they're being stenographers. I don't think that's a correct assessment. I think you have to look you have to look at the entire information ecosystem, which is a bit of a mess, and it depends on where you're getting your information. I mean, if there are amazing reporters, local reporters based in Minnesota who have done fantastic work on the ground. Of course, there are lots of national outlets who have reporters on the ground, and they're doing great work. So I think you have to look at what your source is because there is still a ton of fantastic journalism that is out there, credible reporters and credible outlets that are doing their best to hold, the government to account, whether it's ICE, other federal officials within Minnesota, here in Washington. So I think people need to be careful and cautious about where they're getting their information because if you're getting your information from the right places, you are getting credible information that is telling you exactly what is happening on the ground. Unfortunately, there are others who, for whether political reasons, whether financial reasons, because maybe knowing the way that social media algorithms work, they're feeding people lies, frankly, in some cases, or spin, if you want to put it a little bit more diplomatically. But in many cases, it is straight out disinformation. So it just matters where people are getting their information. There is still a ton of great work that is happening on the ground.
Right, because and that, I guess, goes to another way in which the freedom of the press can be counted, right? It's not just in the censor of reporters or in the closing of outlets, although that's a lot of important, but there are these subtler methods of coercion that we're also seeing operationalized in many ways. One of those is ownership, right? What's happened in the ownership space over the last quarter century that has made press freedom more problematic?
Yeah, we certainly have seen a lot of consolidation. We've seen, lots of the large newspaper companies, for example, and I think sometimes we maybe falsely use newspaper as a proxy for credible information, which I think is a mistake. But there are lots of other great sources of information beyond newspapers. But that said, we've seen thousands of newspapers close their doors. We've seen ownership consolidate. We've seen, in some cases, billionaire tech owners, the Washington Post, my former employer, comes to mind, purchase these assets. In some cases, have done a great job. This is not to say that they have all done poorly, because that's not the case. But certainly in the case of Jeff Bezos, just the news that we've seen over the past few days with layoffs, the pulling of a presidential endorsement, the changing the direction of the editorial page. But this also isn't an issue related to newspapers. We've seen it in broadcast, where now there are just a small handful of players that own a large percentage of the affiliate stations across the country. So we have seen a significant, even if you look at newspapers, for example, you've seen in many cases these kind of venture capitalist companies come in and sell the place for parts in some ways and reduce the number of reporters that they have. So yeah, it is a tough industry. The economics are very challenging right now. There have been some success stories, particularly in the kind of the nonprofit newsroom space. But yeah, the consolidation has only, I think, caused a continued reduction in the number of reporters that we're seeing. And frankly, it's reduced the viewpoints that people have access to when you have just a small handful of organizations that control, have so much control over the information space.
Yeah, and the kind of leverage being used for even those which aren't ideologically aligned with the current administration, they're getting a lot of leverage put in their way. Again, if we go back to your former employer, the Washington Post, I think it must have been 4 Super Bowls ago when they put out the "Democracy Dies in Darkness" commercial, right? Which was this big glossy thing, which was ominous, and the music swelled and whatnot, and they staked a claim against this type of thing. What happened in Trump 2 regime that made Washington Post do such an about face?
Yeah, it's just been so demoralizing and disheartening to see what's happened. And I have so much respect for my former colleagues who no longer have jobs, and certainly those who are still within the newsroom, but have seen, are kind of working in a space with so many fewer people now. I think that the Jeff Bezos that owned the Washington Post for the first many, many years, he bought it in 2013, I believe, is not the Jeff Bezos, frankly, that we see today. He was he was a fantastic owner. He was hands off. Never once did he insert his will or his opinion into the news pages at all. And I don't, I didn't work on the opinion side, but I wasn't aware of anything happening there as well. So a great owner, put, a ton of resources into the product, expanded the newsroom significantly, and then, now we see him at the side of the president, a president who, criticizes and harms a free press at every turn whenever he can. And I think that Jeff Bezos I think he probably has more interest in the company which is the source of his wealth, of course, Amazon, and also his passion is Blue Origin, the space company that he owns. And just a few days ago, Pete Hegseth, who kicked out the Washington Post and many other credible news outlets, visited Jeff Bezos in Florida, I believe, and Bezos was singing his praise, talking about how great it was that he was there. And it's just the side by side of seeing that happening as reporters are being booted from the Pentagon, and the Post is losing a third, probably more than 1/3 of its staff. Of course, that coming after a couple of other rounds of buyouts in recent years has just been really sad to see. And it's harmful for the Post, but it's harmful for the entire industry that holds power to account. And it just shows how journalism is struggling, and it's awful news for democracy as a whole, really.
Yeah, like you said, I think what's happened in Washington, you could say, has been happening in cities all over the country, right? Where metro papers that used to have a local base and a local readership just stopped being metro papers, right?
Yeah.
And I think they just canceled the metro section and the book section and a bunch of other sections that would have been germane to their readers, right?
So they didn't cancel the Metro section, but when I was there in 2023, the Metro staff had 75 staff members, so reporters and editors, and now I believe it's down to something like 12. And there still is a Metro section, but it is significantly smaller. They did remove the sports section with the exception of 4 reporters who are staying, but as you said, the books section is gone. And I mean, really, there were no department kind of left unscathed. Others, of course, were hit more than others, but there is a Metro section. It is much, much smaller than it has been in quite some time.
Right. So you were implying with Bezos, and again, if this wasn't what you're implying, I apologize, that because he has other business in front of the administration, that gives them a certain amount of leverage to force him to bring his, reporters to heel, essentially, right?
Well, I wouldn't say, I don't think that, Bezos is not, he certainly made his opinions known within the editorial pages, on the opinion side, shifting the focus to, personal liberties and a kind of a more administration-friendly tone and content. There's no question about that. I mean, he's come out to say that. The news pages are still, the news reporters are still doing fantastic work. And so what I don't think that you can read into this, that these changes were made and these reductions were made to reduce necessarily the amount of criticism against the administration, because if you look at the reporters who remain, those covering national politics, those covering the White House were kind of disproportionately not affected by these decisions, and we still see a ton of great journalism coming out of that newsroom focused on the White House and the administration. So that is still happening. There's a lot of great work that is still happening, but I do think that we've seen that the owner has kind of shifted his focus, I guess, away from journalism and where he was so supportive for many, many years to his passion of Blue Origin and, of course, Amazon and wanting to support those two entities.
Yeah, Amazon, which did have a case against it at the Federal Trade Commission for antitrust, that there have been a series of things that would make one think about that. The firing of Ann Telnace, the Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist who did a cartoon showing Bezos paying tribute at the feet of Trump and was promptly let go soon thereafter. So, but I guess what I'm getting at is I guess there's subtler forms of coercion than just, stopping the press. And you see that with what they're doing at a number of places, even regime-friendly papers like the Wall Street Journal, right? The Trump administration put a slap suit against them, or maybe it was Trump's individual lawyer put a slap suit against them. It's become so difficult to tell the difference between the two of them. They threatened to sue them for writing stories about the Epstein affair, right? And we see this also with ABC. We see it with CBS, where there were lawsuits that were basically had no standing on facts, where that coercion, that leverage was used against these outfits who might have been holding them accountable.
Yeah, and I think, one word, intimidation. And it's not just in many cases, these lawsuits that are filed, I would say the goal is not necessarily to win. I think Trump knows in many cases he might not come out victorious. Now, he has come out with a couple of $16 million settlements. But I think the bigger picture here is intimidation of, trying to influence editorial decisions when he can't actually, doesn't actually have a say in those decisions. Now, and of course, he has removed funding from outlets where he can, but let's say other smaller newsrooms or even larger newsrooms have reporters who are trying to do the work of holding the administration to account. They're trying to intimidate them into reporters into making them think twice really about the stories that they try to pursue, make them kind of question whether this is the right move. If I report the wrong thing, could the president come after me? Could he file a lawsuit? And the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and other of some of the largest media organizations in the country, they can withstand a lawsuit. They have lawyers on staff. They can handle this and they will be perfectly fine. What is problematic is when smaller outlets or freelance reporters who don't have the backing of a major institution behind them start to think twice about their reporting and what stories they are putting out there and publishing. That chilling effect is a lot of what is behind the actions of the administration. And I'm not, this isn't just the lawsuits that have been filed. It really is a through line for all of the actions that we've seen. It's reducing credible information that's out there to try to control the narrative, but it's also trying to have an impact on all reporters across the entire industry to intimidate them and try to make them think twice about their coverage and what, the stories that they're putting out there.
One of the levers that they have at their disposal is the Federal Communications Commission, right? The FCC. How have they used the FCC to do some of this coercive work?
First of all, the FCC has opened investigations against every network with the exception of Fox, of course, which is owned by Trump ally Rupert Murdoch, although he did sue, of course, Trump did sue Rupert Murdoch's Wall Street Journal. But from PBS to NPR, the other three networks have all faced investigations. Some of those investigations, dovetailed, the CBS and ABC dovetailed with the lawsuits that Trump had filed. So we've seen the threatening of broadcast licenses. Of course, the Jimmy Kimmel with Brendan Carr, the FCC chairman, saying we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Speaking on a right-leaning podcasters network. So and then even more recently, the equal time rule has made headlines with the FCC opening an investigation into The View. So we have seen from a regulatory standpoint, and it really is this onslaught against credible information. And when Brendan Carr was named to the post, Trump called him a warrior for free speech. Similar things have been said about Elon Musk, of course, who had a large role with Doge in the federal government earlier in Trump's term. Trump himself has made the claim that he is a warrior for free speech. And in every case, from the FCC to Elon Musk to the actions of Trump, it is quite the opposite. They are for free speech when it supports their narrative and their version of events, but they are very much opposed to it when what is being said does not align with their narrative. And I think that is what we are seeing currently with the FCC, much like we're seeing across the administration.
There was a J.D. Vance did a talk, Red Meat talk, to some organization, and they were talking about universities, which has become another site where freedom of expression is being hit. And he one of the talking points that he said was that we must use power ruthlessly. And I do think that there's some degree of ruthlessness to the use of the FCC, especially, right? That any company that is coming up for license renewal knows that this is coming their way now, knows that they had best play nice, or they might not get their license again, right?
Exactly. And a couple of the large companies that pulled Jimmy Kimmel, for example, had business before the FCC. Mm-hmm. And I think there's this sense that, that Trump himself and Brendan Carr have, they've got their thumb on the scale in the way that we just haven't seen before. I mean, the FCC is typically kind of this sleepy organization within the federal government, or agency within the federal government that you hear about occasionally, but it kind of does its work in a non-partisan, non-political way, and that just has not been the case over the last 12 months.
Yeah, I mean, the big conglomeration is always bad for freedom of expression, I would argue, because you limit the range of viewpoints out there, you make it more ownership friendly, all these things that we know from years and years of study that this doesn't work very well. And yet, this is the thing that I think over the last quarter century has been eroding the most.
Yeah.
This case of CBS, I think, is the one that kind of puts all the things you've just been talking about in stark relief, right? That there was a merger potential with Skydance and Paramount merging together, which puts and this was a Trump-friendly oligarch. I think you can say Larry Ellison is an oligarch, fifth richest man in the world or something like that. Sure. There was a settlement. There was a suit against CBS for doing something that reporters do all the time, right? Which is making a slight cut in a Kamala Harris interview to make it fit in the half hour of television, right, or less. Mm-hmm. It was a 60 minutes piece. But this kind of set up a cascade of conglomeration effects, right? CBS agreed to the settlement without suit, which is, again, fairly new in recent history. Most news orgs would have sued because they knew their stuff was reported well. They knew they could stand behind it. But in order to get this merger, they settled the suit, and they agreed to all kinds of conditions that are chilling, right? They agreed to have a bias monitor at CBS News that would report directly to Trump. They agreed to end any DEI practice within the organization. All of these things are unprecedented, I think, when tied to conglomeration in this way.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And it follows the kind of follows the pattern that we've seen. And of course, the Ellisons then installed Barry Weiss from the Free Press to oversee CBS News, and which rightfully got many headlines in and of itself. So you're right; it is very much a pattern that we've seen where just this politicized FCC is kind of front and center in a lot of these decisions that typically, had not played that same sort of role.
And then the Ellisons just also got TikTok, right? So they now
Mhm.
have TikTok, and the other big merger that is still in the works is the Warner Brothers, Time Warner, which Netflix had made a bid. Larry Ellison's boy made a bid as well. Trump seems to be siding with that and trying to block the Netflix bid, which would put even CNN and CBS under the control of the same oligarch-friendly news owner, right? And this becomes a big problem for a democracy that depends on a kind of range of opinion and experience in order to solve shared problems.
Yeah, I think we'll see how that all shakes out, but certainly that's going to be that's going to be kind of a process that is going to take quite a bit of time to figure out where that all lands.
Yeah. One of the things that has been interesting that the Trump administration did after it, arrested Don Lemon and Georgia Fort was that it started messaging something interesting in relation to press freedom, which was that Don Lemon wasn't a journalist. What do you make of that, and what is the distinction do you think that they're trying to set up?
Well, I think that the fact that Don Lemon and Georgia Fort were arrested for, I mean, look, the reality is that they were doing journalism. Don Lemon said many times on camera that he is only here observing and committing an act of journalism as this protest was taking place. And so, there's no question that he was a journalist. I think that we know that the relationship between Donald Trump and Don Lemon has been fraught for some time, and Trump has said many negative things about Don Lemon and his former employer CNN over the years, and this was an opportunity. This comes after the courts said that there was not enough evidence to bring charges against Don Lemon, and yet we saw this happen anyway. So, and also connected to that protest in St. Paul was the fact that the White House put out the faked image of Nikema Levy Armstrong with tears running down her face. And, I think that gets, and, her skin had been darkened. In reality, she was arrested during this protest, was very kind of calm and composed. And then in the White House, kind of getting back to the disinformation that we were talking about earlier, puts this synthetic, this generative AI image out on social media, trying to portray her as something that she was not doing, much like you mentioned with Don Lemon in this circumstance. So I think it is another example of the trying to control the narrative in ways that we just haven't seen before, just such an elevation. And yeah, we just haven't really seen seen particularly, disinformation used in this way. It's not unusual now to see generative AI, kind of faked images from the White House, but what set that image apart in my mind was just how brazen it was. You couldn't tell just by looking at that photo that it was fake. In the past, when the White House puts out fake images, you can, they're not necessarily trying to pass them off as real. It really is, you can kind of tell they've been faked, but it's kind of, it's to advance a narrative or some sort of policy agenda. But there was no text that indicated it was fake. Anyone who had just come across that would think it was real. And in that regard, it really was another escalation just over the last month or two that we've seen from this administration.
Another escalation, I guess you could call it, or at least a rhetorical lever, I guess maybe you would call it, that they're doing is they're weaponizing the word doxing, right? That they're accusing reporters of doxing. What do you make of that?
I think one of we've seen that particular there is a reporter Seth Harp who received a subpoena from Congress, and so I think it's another example of showing how this isn't just the White House. This has taken over many facets of the federal government. In this case, a congressional subpoena. But I think it all gets back to intimidation, and there are the legal threats, threats of being drained financially, and then these threats of the subpoena, or in some cases actual subpoenas that have been given to reporters, and in some cases compelling them to appear before Congress. It's another effort by the government to try to wield its power to clamp down on credible information and trying to intimidate them. And it's just another example, I think, within that playbook.
Yeah. I mean, that isn't doxing, though, right? If a reporter reveals the name of somebody in power and lets the public know about it, that's not doxing, right?
That is not doxing, right? I mean, and this, in so many of these cases, it is public information. They're finding information publicly, which is what journalists do, and that is the role of a journalist, and it is being weaponized. And I think that can only happen in an environment in which there is low public trust within media. I mean, I wish we would see more of the public stand up and fight back against these sorts of things. But it is something that we are seeing more and more with more and more frequency, which is I think frankly terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem as if they're following the old playbook, which has long been part of political electioneering, which is to run the negatives, right? Run the negatives up on the opposition. And Steve Bannon famously said that, the Democrats aren't the opposition. They don't matter. What matters is the press. And so I noticed that just during the last year, the Trump administration launched a wall of shame where they were going to put accountability journalists up on it and encourage citizens to rat out journalists who are not regime friendly. I mean, again, this is all unprecedented in my lifetime. Maybe you could find examples of this in the 50s, or maybe during the first big kind of Red Scare in the 1920s, which is where I was wondering if that's when Penn America started up. It was during when the Postmaster General took over control of and kind of squashed the radical press in the 1920s. But again, these are wholly new things that we're seeing, and it speaks to an administration that just does not have a commitment to democracy.
Right. And and it's not just the news media that have been targeted, of course. I mean, that's where my focus is. And, just from a democratic standpoint is so crucial, but it's not just the media. We've seen law firms targeted. We've seen institutions of higher education targeted. We've seen cultural institutions targeted, from the Kennedy Center to the Smithsonian Institution. So this is a long, these tactics that are used on the press, similar tactics are being used across society in an effort to control the narrative. I mean, they don't want you. There's an effort, of course, to control what you can see, like at the Smithsonian Institution, where they're pulling back and changing, the wording of certain exhibits, for example. There are words that are being banned on federal websites, and all of this is happening at the same time in an effort to try to police what sort of information Americans and really everyone is exposed to, and it's just an effort to manipulate that flow of information.
It does seem
And
like
at the same time, the White House itself has beefed up its communications staff and freely admit that in many ways they're trying to bypass the media and speak to them directly, which is perfectly fine. All administrations, I mean, all administrations make changes, right? I mean, there are certain words or certain policies, certainly policies that are allowed, that are not allowed. But what we have seen within the Trump 2.0 just goes so far beyond what we have seen any other administration do, and that is that's what makes this so noteworthy and so crucial and such a threat to democracy, is because all of these very significant things are happening all at the same time, and there just seems to be no end to it.
You talked earlier about how the administration had defunded and dismantled the global media, U.S. Global Media Agency, the U.S. Agency for Global Media is what it's called. And they oversee the allocation of funds to U.S. public broadcasters like Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, the Middle East Broadcast Network, Radio and Television Marti, Radio Free Asia. What is the impact of all of, in a global sense, what's the impact of these particular outlets being silenced or, muted, at least by the administration?
So those outlets have been a crucial form of soft power for the United States, for some 80 plus years. And though they have just, systematically been dismantled. Now, it does look like some funding has been restored for them, which is great news. But yes, the staffs were dismantled, they were booted from the airwaves in these countries that are very fragile, where the United States has long been able to provide credible information under authoritarian regimes. The United States has been, we've been the source of information for people who had no other source of credible information. And that almost disappeared entirely. And at the same time, it opens the doors for these authoritarian leaders to be able to, it kind of gives them a green light, right? If they're seeing the United States president crack down on the media in this way, what's to stop them from doing even more than they've done? Or it allows them an entry point to crack down further and crack down on dissent. And I think we've seen more and more of that, and we've seen the doors open for other countries, whether it be Russia, whether it be China, whether it be Iran, to fill that void. So if the United States is no longer broadcasting in these specific countries, it allows others to fill that void and bring their own narrative to the situation. So I think there are lots of dangerous aspects to what we've seen, and I do hope that there's bipartisan support for bringing this back, and I hope that we see those outlets back up and running and bringing credible information and kind of restoring the soft power that we've had for so many decades.
I hope so too. Just as our listeners kind of think about what they might be able to do, what should they be aware of? What should they be on the lookout for? And what might they do to help reverse some of the backsliding that we're seeing?
I would say first and foremost, look at the sources of information, where you're getting your information, and make sure you're getting credible information, and support journalists, support outlets and experts who are doing the hard work of bringing credible information to the public, and don't amplify falsehoods. I think that's another crucial thing. If you come across something on social media, you think it might not be accurate, check to make sure, see if other credible sources are reporting that. See if you can get other, metadata, dates, those sorts of things before you hit send or post. Just make sure you're not amplifying it, because when you publish something, when you post something on social media, you are giving it air, you're amplifying it, and in this very polluted media ecosystem that we are in, everyone has a role in that, of policing what you at least can put on your own timeline. So I would just urge extreme caution for amplifying anything, but really support journalism, donate, to nonprofits and others who are doing this hard work, because it is such a crucial moment in history, and journalism is under threat from so many different ways, on so many different levels. And so I think anything that we can do to support those who are doing that hard work will go a long way.
Great. Tim Richardson, thank you so much for being with us and sharing us some of your wisdom.
Thank you so much for having me.
Cory, having missed out on your chance to ask some questions, and I missed your wisdom in that part of it, having listened to it, what are some of the things that come to your ear?
I think what I really took away from this episode, having to get to just listen, is that so many of the things you discussed felt like we were on maybe sort of a gradual awareness that things were getting worse in these particular areas for individual journalists, for the industry. And then this second Trump administration has just really, really catalyzed in blinking red lights some of the circumstances in which we're seeing, more direct attacks on journalism as an institution, on individual journalists, the really explicit kind of chilling effects that the industry is feeling, and the way that that's kind of connecting to the economic challenges that places like the Washington Post are having placed upon them by their now Trump sympathetic executives, right? Even down to something like the weaponizing of doxing in the sense that that is being used as a cudgel to go after journalists who are simply just doing their job. So all of these things that have been in the ether for a very long time, and certainly since the first Trump administration, have just gotten so much more significant and in our face as problems that don't have a very clear, easy solution that, if we have a different administration or different people in power, that suddenly all of this is going to be fixed again, right? What did you think now, having a little time to think about your questions?
I've been, reading the work of Tim and of Penn America, and again, they work in a number of different spaces. They work in the space of kind of the attack on freedom of speech in higher education. They work on the book banning that is going on across the country. And the ground of those pieces that I've read are always an awareness of the importance of the free press. And so for years and years, basically everybody who is out there has defended the free press. So that shouldn't be controversial. So I think one of the things that has surprised me in this whole last year of, where we took all those anxieties about threats to the freedom of the press and we just materialized them. What surprised me is how, even though there's all this groundwork for making and articulating the rationale for why you need a free press, that the press has been so unwilling to make that argument, right? That there isn't much of a pushback from journalists, and that could be a symptom of the effect of the chill that this regime has unleashed.
Yeah, there's something definitely different in the air, too, about the modes and forms of resistance that we're seeing if you compare the first Trump administration to this one, right? And obviously so many things have changed in between those 4 or 5 years, right? But the way in which journalists have either become less outspoken or there are fewer people working at some of these places to be able to shine a light on some of the things that are happening to them, to the just, the negative effects of the media environment that so many people operate in, right? It's something that gives us a lot of concern on this show, and it's hard not to think about that with all of our guests, but especially after this one.
That's it for this episode of News Over Noise. Our guest was Tim Richardson, Program Director for Journalism and Disinformation at Penn America. To learn more, visit newsovernoise.org. I'm Matt Jordan.
And I'm Cory Barker.
Until next time, stay well and well informed.
News Over Noise is produced by the Penn State Donald P. Bellisario College of Communications and WPSU. This program has been funded by the Office of the Executive Vice President and Provost at Penn State and is part of the Penn State News Literacy Initiative.